Welcome everybody. I'm loving all the energy and the fact that the room is full and I see students from different classes here, and my board members from the Erbelding Center, and some faculty as well. My name is Wendy Lauer. I'm the John K. Ross Professor of History and I'm the Director of the Erbelding Center, and I want to welcome everybody and I hope you enjoy your lunch. And I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, still my colleague, from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., who has just published an absolutely fabulous book. What did Americans know and what did they or didn't do during the Holocaust? Now, we judge this in hindsight because we know what happened, right? We say, why didn't they respond? Because we know what happened in 1945 when the camps were liberated, what we discovered. And we lose sight of what was happening at the time, right? So this is one of the classic problems in historical interpretation analysis, is that we judge things too much from the present, even though we know there are a lot of parallels today in the present to the history of the Holocaust and the crises in Europe at that time. But the newspapers were filled with stories on this history. The museum initiated a program called History Unfolded, so Americans knew a lot. And it was not just the New York Times, it was local papers. And there were clear headlines, especially after Kristallnacht, the pogrom of 1938, about the dire situation of the Jews. And of course, the British responded with the Kindertransport. And so there were moments in the history when Americans could have responded because the information was clearly there. And ordinary Americans, many of them did respond. Even students, if you look at student newspapers, wrote editorials about how students could collect money and do local fundraising on campus to sponsor refugees. So there are a lot of different responses. We don't have one response. The record is not so great, with few exceptions, and Rebecca is going to highlight probably the most important, because it ultimately took leadership in Washington to overcome a lot of the xenophobia, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the shadow of the Great Depression, what was going on in the Deep South, of course, and the lynchings. This is the context of the 30s in particular that was really instrumental in shaping people's immigration policies at the time. Rebecca's book, Rescue Board, which is for sale out here, thank you to the Home Bookstore for saying that, is an absolutely fascinating, riveting read. The reviews have been phenomenal. I'm not surprised, because Rebecca, who completed her PhD at George Mason University in 2015, right, yeah. Yep. And turned her dissertation around to a book very, very quickly, like a tenure track professor would. And who is a historian at the Holocaust Museum, and prior to that, joined the museum in 2003, was in curating, and conservation area, and also made a name for herself prior to this book in articles in the New Yorker when the museum discovered, an object was brought into the museum, to be more precise, which was the so-called Hooker album. This was an SS officer who was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the album showed a lot of photos of SS officers with their female auxiliaries recreating, including Mengele. It cast in a completely different light on how the Nazis were administering that camp and what they were doing on their off time. In any event, Rebecca's book, which turns our attention to response, turns our attention to the War Refugee Board, which was created in 1944. And some of the members, after the fact, who were interviewed said, it was a little too late. And that's kind of been the story thus far. There's been a very critical understanding of the board and of Roosevelt. He's at the center of this debate and his response. And you've just done incredibly pioneering research in the archives to piece together what is a very complicated history, diplomatic and interagency history, and the biographies of some of these folks, like Pela in the Treasury Department and Morgenthau, and given us that dimension. And some of them were really beacons of hope then and now. And so this is an important lesson for our crises that we are in today. And the very last thing I'm going to say is that I want to encourage you to look at to read Rebecca's book, but also she's been actively writing op-eds in the Washington Post. So she brings a kind of public face to this history, educates the public more generally about the historical parallels, which are not that straightforward, actually. And just as recently, in May 2018, the Post article she published was entitled "The Trump Administration's refugee and border policies cruelly ignore the lessons of the past. So I encourage you to kind of Google her and see what she's doing in terms of the present day. And please come to the podium. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to see so many people, especially on a Friday, come out to learn about the Holocaust is really gratifying. When I talk about the War Refugee Board, I usually start pretty early, about a year and a half before the board is founded, in the first full weekend of August 1942, in the Les Milles internment camp in southern France. So the U.S. still had relations in southern France, even after Pearl Harbor, because southern France, Vichy France, was a collaborationist regime, but the Americans maintained diplomatic ties, and so there are Americans in southern France in the fall of 1942 and in the summer of 1942. One of them is 28-year-old Roswell McClellan. He was working for the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization, in the Les Milles internment camp. He was distributing relief. And he watches, the first weekend of August 1942, watches the first wave of deportations from southern France of foreign Jews north to Drancy, a camp outside of Paris, and from there to Auschwitz. He knew where these people were going, where these Jewish transports were going in very vague terms. And a week earlier, he and a group of his Quaker colleagues had gone to Vichy, to the capital of collaborationist France, and had protested to Pierre Laval, the head of the Vichy French government, trying to get him to order the deportations to stop. The Quakers argued that the Nazis planned to, and this is a direct quote from his notes at the time, exterminate these people. And Laval had laughed at him. He said, that's a fiction. They are going to special ethnic reservations in Poland where they'll be treated well. And anyway, if the United States is so concerned about the Jews, why aren't we taking them? So Rescue Board, my book, is about how we got there, how immigration laws were structured from 1924 specifically to keep out Southern and Eastern Europeans, particularly Jews, how in the early years of the Nazi regime, Jews in the U.S. differed on how and whether to protest what the Nazis were doing. They were afraid of stirring up anti-Semitism here in this country, which was potent and very real. It's the story of how the American people and their government were so anti-immigrant in the 1930s that in April 1938, right after Nazi Germany annexes Austria, a group of Jewish congressmen get together and decide amongst themselves that no one is going to introduce any new laws to open up immigration, because raising the debate would be so toxic in Washington that it would only result in laws that would cut immigration even further. It was best to keep things as they were. And it's the story of a refugee crisis that extends past Pearl Harbor, as Jews still in Lisbon, in Casablanca, and in southern France are still actively trying to get to the United States. And it's the story of how a guy from California, a 28-year-old from California, could be witnessing, he was from Palo Alto, could be on the ground in France witnessing deportations. But mainly it's about what happened next, because Ross McClellan was not the only person working the first full weekend of August 1942. Gerhard Rickner, the World Jewish Congress's representative in Switzerland, had just learned that rumors of mass killing in the East actually had a purpose. That the Nazis had a plan to gather up Jews, take them to the East, and murder them there en masse. This seems obvious to us now. We read history backwards, as Wendy was saying, and so we look back in 1933 and we don't understand how people didn't know at the time that this would end in genocide. Of course, they didn't know that. We have no idea what is going to happen in 5 years to vulnerable populations around the world, and they didn't know in 1933. The Nazis didn't even know in 1933 that mass murder was the end of all of this. So they saw no precedent. There was no word genocide. And so this idea that during a war, when all resources should be going towards the war effort, that the Nazis would divert any resources to a mass murder plan seemed really preposterous to people. And Jews had been subjected to pogroms before. And the idea was, well, we hear these rumors, but those pogroms always ended, and things got back to normal. So the idea that there was a plan to murder all of the Jews of Europe was different. Rigner tries to send his news to New York, to his bosses in New York, via the State Department in Switzerland. Switzerland was completely surrounded by enemy territory, and so Rigner tries to send things out through this communications channel that the State Department has. In Washington, officials block the message. They say that it's a war rumor, that this couldn't possibly be true. And one says, I just can't see why they put this thing in a telegram. But the news of the Nazi extermination plan arrived in New York anyway, late and via Western Union. And by November 1942, it was public knowledge. It was in newspapers that the Nazis had this plan. And from then on, Americans, at least to the extent that they were paying attention in the midst of a world war, could have had this information, and it is accepted as fact after that. By that time, Ross McClelland and his pregnant wife have escaped Switzerland, or escaped France and gone into Switzerland. The Americans who were in Vichy France were arrested and interned in Nazi Germany for the next year and a half. And so for more than a year after the news of the final solution has reached the United States, the State Department tries to quell public pressure for any sort of rescue. They're not very successful in that. Activists stage rallies and pageants. There are full-page newspaper ads in the New York Times and in newspapers across the country condemning the Roosevelt administration for not doing more, condemning the State Department for not getting involved. In October 1943, hundreds of Orthodox rabbis march on the Capitol, singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the Lincoln Memorial and asking their government to do something beyond just fighting war, something to try to rescue people. Mass rescue is impossible at this point. So what they're asking for is aid on the margins. Help people who are in border countries escape, help keep people inside Nazi territory alive as long as possible. The Allies at this point only have a very tenuous grasp on the European continent and are thousands of miles away from the death camps where most people are being liberated or being murdered at this point. At this point in the story, a group of Treasury Department lawyers, most of them are in their 30s, enter. They're quite unlikely heroes. You don't think of Treasury Department lawyers as the heroes of a story. But this group spends the fall of 1943 frustrated by the State Department, like everybody else. They are frustrated that the State Department is delaying small amounts of humanitarian aid that NGOs want to send into Europe to aid Jews. So at this time we had very rudimentary economic sanctions over Nazi territory, and humanitarian aid organizations had to apply for a license to get permission from the US government to send humanitarian aid into Nazi territory. The Treasury Department was approving this aid, the State Department was delaying it and delaying it and delaying it. So as the Treasury Department starts writing a big government memo detailing all of the different excuses that the State Department has been giving for this humanitarian aid, for delaying it, they discover evidence that not only have the delays been happening, but that the State Department had specifically instructed the US legation in Switzerland to stop sending information about the Holocaust to the United States. That this information about the mass murders was trickling out to the American people, and they were rallying for action. And so if the American people don't know, they won't protest. So one of the best things about studying the Treasury Department, unexpectedly, is that Henry Morgenthau Jr., FDR's Treasury Secretary and the only Jewish cabinet member, he recorded all of his conversations. He either had a stenographer in the room or he had these rubber tapes that would play during meetings or phone calls, and someone would transcribe them later. So you can go back if you want to and start in 1934 and read every single meeting, every single phone call he had. You can read them, everything that everyone says. And so at the end of December 1943, Josiah Du Bois, a lawyer at Treasury, says in one of their meetings, "Mr. Secretary, the only question we have in our minds, I think, is the bull has to be taken by the horns in dealing with this Jewish issue and get this thing out of the State Department into some agency's hands that is willing to deal with it frontally. For instance, take the complaint, what are we going to do with the Jews? We let them die because we don't know what to do with them." And then Randolph Paul, the Treasury Department's general counsel, quietly adds, "We are speaking as citizens now." So our armed with their evidence of the State Department's obstruction and buoyed by the fact that the Assistant Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long, who was the head of the Visa Division and dealt with refugee issues, had just been accused of lying to Congress. The Treasury Department wrote a memo. If you read government memos, the title of this one will surprise you because most government memos are pretty boring. This one is entitled, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. I will quote from it a little bit. One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated. Unless remedial steps of a drastic nature are taken and taken immediately, I am certain that no effective action will be taken by this government to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and that this government will have to share for all time responsibility for the extermination. They convinced Morgenthau that it was time to go to FDR and demand, as one of them put it in the meeting, a new deal. On Sunday, January 16th, Morgenthau, Randolph Paul, and John Paley, who was the head of the part of Treasury that dealt with economic sanctions, met with Roosevelt for less than an hour. They gave him their evidence, they gave him a revised version of that memo, summarized it for him, and gave him the draft of an executive order establishing a War Refugee Board, a new agency taking away the power that the State Department had over relief and rescue and giving it to this new agency. Nominally headed by the Secretaries of War, State, and Treasury, it was actually headed by John Paley, the Assistant to the Secretary of the Treasury. The board was housed on the third floor of the Treasury Department. It was staffed almost entirely by Treasury Department personnel. All departments and embassies around the world were instructed to cooperate with War Refugee Board programs. So starting in January 1944, the United States had a policy about the Holocaust, and it was a policy of relief and rescue. And 17 months later, in May 1944, when the war in Europe, 45, when the war in Europe ended, the War Refugee Board had saved tens of thousands of lives. Rescue Board, my book, is the first non-self-published book about the War Refugee Board, who they were and what they did. And this was very surprising to me. I worked on this book for about a decade. It was my doctoral dissertation, as Wendy said, and then published it as a book. And since thousands of books are published about the Holocaust every year, I kind of expected sometime in that decade for somebody to come up and publish it before me. The 3 self-published books that have been written about the War Refugee Board have all come out in the last 5 years, but they're all reliant on some old scholarship. Arthur Morris's 1960s book, While 6 Million Died, there's 1984, The Abandonment of the Jews by David Wyman, and all of these books kind of parrot each other in this game of historian telephone. So one person will say one thing, and one person will cite the other person and make a couple of changes, and then another person will cite another person and make a couple of changes. And the story just gets more dramatic and less complicated. And so we have this oversimplified idea of the United States could have saved all the Jews had we wanted to, had Roosevelt not been anti-Semitic. Or we have this idea of the American people knew either nothing about what was going on or they knew everything about what was going on. And either way, they didn't do anything about it. And it's never that simple. Americans don't speak with one voice on any issue ever. And it was as complicated back then and as nuanced and as gray. I want to tell you a couple of stories from the book about their work, but also another reason why the War Refugee Board's work and story has been largely forgotten is that their archival records are very difficult to navigate. They are still in about 120 boxes at the FDR Library in their original 1944-1945 order. However, the secretaries decided to file things that day. And so the subject, evacuation to and from Turkey is about 4 boxes of just everything having to do with Turkey. But they also had an alphabetical series, so it could be under the subject if the letter's about Turkey, or it could be alphabetical by the name of the person who wrote it. So you have 120 boxes that is basically just papers. So I spent the first 2 years of my work photographing the entire thing and then renaming all of these PDFs that I made and putting them in chronological order so that I could read through and actually write it as they experienced it. And that's how I did my dissertation. I would figure out, okay, well, there are big topics between here, so I will just read everything that they did between these 2 points, then write a chapter, then everything they did and write a chapter. And so it is a way to get around this idea of hindsight. I didn't know often whether a project would be successful. There wasn't enough written about the War Refugee Board for me to even be able to tell. And so I was experiencing things as they did and learning information as they did, which was really interesting. By the end, I had about 43,000 individual documents that I was reading through from a whole host of different archives and the War Refugee Board stuff. And this chronology is incredibly important because 1944 and 1945, the prospect of rescue changes as the war does. When the Allies land on D-Day, that opens up a new front. That opens up armies that are closer to people who can then be rescued or liberated. Options are different before and after the Bulge to get people in and out of Nazi territory. And so as the Allied armies move, the logistics of rescue changes. And the leverage that the United States has over Nazi Germany and over especially the neutral nations, Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Turkey, and Spain, all changes as the war changes. And so the War Refugee Board's records and the way that historians have talked about this agency hasn't changed or hasn't adjusted to deal with those changes. The War Refugee Board tried so many different things. John Paley, the head of the board, had never been to Europe. And he is thrust into this position in January 1944 to be in charge of U.S. rescue on a continent that he's never seen, in an area that is completely closed to Allied personnel. And so how do you begin to deal with that? What do you do first? And so the first thing that the board did was they solicited advice from NGOs, which is a kind of novel thing for the US government to do, they wrote to over 100 different organizations and said, what are your ideas? What should we be doing? They started immediately changing the license procedure, changing the way that humanitarian aid organizations could send money overseas. By the time the war ended, the board had authorized about $11 million in humanitarian aid to go to Europe, which is the equivalent of about $154 million today. That went to buy guns for the French underground, false papers, food for children in hiding, and payment for guides to help Jews escape over the borders. The board appointed their own representatives in the neutral nations, in Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, and North Africa. Eventually they had someone in London. Mainly Treasury Department staff members or humanitarian aid workers, though their guy in Turkey was a Bloomingdale's marketing executive who had happened to be heading there on vacation and decided he wanted to go as a diplomat instead. So he goes and he ends up getting 8,000 Jews from Romania and Bulgaria into Palestine in 1944. These representatives used the leverage of near certain Allied victory at that point, and that is crucial. The War Refugee Board is able to do what it can do because it's almost certain that the Allies are going to win. And they can use these neutral nations to pressure them to accept more refugees over their borders, to protest the Nazi treatment of Jews, and to provide the War Refugee Board with intelligence about what's going on in Nazi territory. The first story that I'll tell you is how the US government laundered money to help refugees sneak into Sweden. So I've presented kind of at length at this point with the Treasury Department, and depending on who I talk to at the Treasury Department, they do not like me calling it money laundering. I talked to a former Treasury Department guy last week, and he said, oh no, it's the dictionary definition of money laundering. They just don't want to admit that the US government was doing this. So most of the War Refugee Board's information from Sweden came via its representative, Ivor Olsen, who was a Treasury Department staff member, had originally gone to Stockholm as the financial attaché for the US Embassy, working for the Treasury Department. That's really just his cover, though. He is an OSS spy. The OSS, the precursor to the CIA. So he's codenamed Crispin, and he is in charge of monitoring the movement of money and war material between Sweden and Nazi Germany. So a very important job. He also, over the course of his duties, recruits Raoul Wallenberg, the now famous Swedish businessman who is sent to Hungary at the request of the War Refugee Board. So the War Refugee Board also has a big hand in Wallenberg's work in Budapest. So that is not the story that I'm going to tell you today, though you'll have to get the book for that. But For much of the summer of 1944, Olson is focused on a hazardous plan to rescue refugees from the Baltic countries, from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania by water. To do this, he needs to get money into Sweden to buy boats and guns. He says that he will need, quote, the most skillfully organized type of underground operations, because the Baltic countries are now virtually sealed to everything. So he finds groups in Sweden, usually headed by former politicians from those countries. He appoints them, and he thinks that they can rescue probably 600 or 700 intellectual, racial, or political refugees from each country. The War Refugee Board pays for this project directly out of their funds from Roosevelt, but they are worried about getting that much money into Sweden under the nose of the Swedish government. They do not want to tell Sweden that they are supporting unauthorized refugee entry into our partner country. And so to do this, and Swedish Jews, Olson writes, are very interested in Jewish relief and rescue operations so long as they do not involve bringing them into Sweden. So John Paley, who in Treasury had been literally in charge of stopping money from getting into the hands of the Nazis, decides to sneak Olson's funds past the Swedish government and people. The staff of Goodyear Tire, no doubt astonished that the Treasury Department is asking them to do this, agreed that if the board transferred $50,000 to their Akron, Ohio headquarters, they would transfer the equivalent in Swedish kroner to Ivor Olson from their factory in Norrköping, Sweden. There are no references to the Goodyear Tire deal in any of the War Refugee Board's papers. It's just a mention on their financial ledger, $50,000 to Goodyear Tire. But Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, received copies of many of the War Refugee Board's daily correspondence, and the War Refugee Board staff forgot to scrub his records. And so it's there. And in a cable in June 1944, Olson wrote, "This arrangement worked well, and although not foolproof, it is desirable from a security point of view. At this time, we do not recommend bank transfers, as receipt of cable transfers of such size by individuals involved in operations unavoidably attract notice and suspicion." So the War Refugee Board staff, many of whom were in charge of economic sanctions, now argued that humanitarian aid was more important than adherence to American law. From Washington, John Paley laid out a twofold strategy for the War Refugee Board: to persuade the Nazis and their collaborators to stop killing, and to try to rescue the people who could still be saved. With so many Jews deep inside Nazi territory, they started a psychological warfare campaign to address the first question, to persuade the Nazis to stop. On March 24th, FDR issued a statement that was written by the War Refugee Board and kind of echoed the acquiescence report. It starts, "In one of the blackest crimes of all history, begun by the Nazis in the day of peace and multiplied by them 100 times in times of war, the wholesale systematic murder of the Jews of Europe goes on unabated every hour." So March 1944 is a crucial period in the Holocaust, because only a few days before FDR's statement, Nazi Germany had invaded Hungary. Hungary was the largest and last largely intact Jewish population in Europe. There are about 800,000 Jews who were either Hungarian or had sought refuge in Hungary earlier in the war. And so once Nazi Germany invades, that entire population is suddenly threatened. So the War Refugee Board added a new paragraph to Roosevelt's statement. "As a result of the events of the last few days, hundreds of thousands of Jews who, while living under persecution, have at least found a haven from death in Hungary and the Balkans, are now threatened with annihilation as Hitler's forces descend more heavily upon these lands. That these innocent people, who have already survived a decade of Hitler's fury, should perish on the very eve of triumph over the barbarism which their persecution symbolizes, would be a major tragedy." One of the problems with coming up with your summary of the War Refugee Board is that you can't lay out how many people survived because of a psychological warfare campaign. You can't say this atrocity would have happened had this person not been dissuaded from doing it. But I was able to interview an elderly German man who was a teenager at the time and remembers finding one of these leaflets in a potato field as he's doing labor in the spring of 1944. The text included Roosevelt's statement alongside news of the war, news of bombings in his area, and he knew that to be true, that yes, those bombings had happened. And so the next weekend, as his high school gathered to celebrate Hitler's birthday on April 20th, he heard a Nazi speaker boast about the secret weapon that the Nazis had that was going to win the war for Germany. And he figured that's probably not true, and that the Holocaust that he had just read about from the Allied leaflet probably was. Switzerland, as I said earlier, was completely surrounded by occupied territory until the fall of 1944. So the War Refugee Board could not bring in a representative and put him in Switzerland. They had to find an American who was already there. So they recruit Roswell McClelland, the same American who was in the French internment camps in the summer of 1942 witnessing deportations. Switzerland, because of its proximity to Nazi Germany and to Eastern Europe, was probably the most difficult and busy post that the War Refugee Board had. Among a myriad of other things, Ross McClelland participated in ransom negotiations with the Nazis, who tried to use America's newfound interest in Jews and the fate of the Jews to get money and war material. They offered, frankly, Jews for sale, and that's the title of a book on these ransom negotiations, Jews for Sale. On the morning of D-Day, Henry Morgenthau Jr. held a 2-hour meeting in his office to talk about the first ransom offer that the Nazis posed, the famous Joel Brand blood for trucks offer. The United States was never going to pay ransom. We don't cross that line. But McClelland and Sally Meyer, the representative of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in Switzerland, managed to string along a group of high-ranking Nazis for about 6 months. On Sunday, November 5th, 1944, Ross went to Zurich to the Hotel Savoy bar on Vide and entered a large conference room where Sally Meyer presented him to SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Becker, who was in an SS uniform, as proof of Roosevelt's personal interest in extending these negotiations. So, in the midst of a world war, an American representative held a top-secret, unauthorized meeting in a neutral country with an SS officer to negotiate on humanitarian matters. McClelland never told the War Refugee Board in Washington he'd ever done this. He kept it secret from them, too. And he and Meyer, in response to that meeting, got more than 1,600 Jews released from Bergen-Belsen, who were dumped on the border of Switzerland as a good faith gesture on the part of the Nazis for continuing to discuss with them. Beyond this, the War Refugee Board packaged and shipped 300,000 food packages into concentration camps. So if you've ever read about a survivor who received a food package in the final weeks of the war, it was almost certainly packed on Long Island, shipped across the sea to Sweden, disguised as a Red Cross package, and taken into concentration camps. They received and passed along requests in June 1944 to bomb Auschwitz, the rail lines leading to the camp, the gas chambers, and the crematorium. Parenthetically, that debate about the bombing of Auschwitz has kind of taken over the scholarship, but it was a blip on their radar at the time. There's maybe 50 documents in the 43,000 that I looked at that actually deal with that question about bombing. In November 1944, the War Refugee Board unilaterally released the Auschwitz Escapees Report, which is known as the Auschwitz Protocols. Reports written by Auschwitz survivors who managed to escape the camp in the spring of 1944 and wrote detailed, graphic information about what they had seen. The War Refugee Board unilaterally releases this to the press, and it is front page news Thanksgiving weekend 1944. Americans, for the first time, learned about the process of arrival, selection, and gassing at Auschwitz, including numbers. The escapees had estimated 1.7 million people had been killed in Auschwitz alone. We now know that's too high, but Americans had that information, and it was front page news. And in response, a week later, the Washington Post introduced Americans to a new word in an op-ed about that report, and they introduced Americans to the word genocide. That was the first time it was ever used in the newspaper. I can keep going on for a while about their projects, but I'll stop here and get to your questions. In conclusion, though, the War Refugee Board's creation was and remains the only time in American history that we ever did this, that the U.S. government founded a government agency dedicated to saving the lives of civilians who were being murdered by our wartime enemy. The 21 months between January 1944 and when the board closes in September 1945 represent this period where American action actually matches our rhetoric about democratic values and the country that we want to be. In contrast to many subsequent American human rights efforts, the War Refugee Board had no secondary cynical motive. It wasn't created because these people are going to be Americans or that these people can do anything for our country. It's not driven by political favor or influence. The refugees in peril, most Americans did not want them to ever come here. It is only because they're going to die, and the U.S. has the ability to try to stop that. Historian Yehuda Bauer wrote, "What made the WRB such a unique body is that it was officially permitted to break practically every important law of a nation at war in the name of outraged humanity." So that the United States would dedicate any resources to a humanitarian crisis while we are fighting an all-out two-front war with fathers and brothers and sons dying daily. John Paley loses his brother in October 1944 and is at work the next day. This is something that they took incredibly seriously. That we would devote resources to this many resources to it is illogical. But it happened, and like I said, saved tens of thousands of lives. And I hope that the War Refugee Board will start to enter our public narrative about American response to the Holocaust, because I think it's really relevant history. The things that they were doing, debating the role of ransom negotiations, debating relief versus rescue, relief that could help a lot of people or trying to rescue a few people, how to bring in refugees to the United States when there are real national security concerns, how many resources should we risk falling into the hands of the enemy. All of these are very real debates that Americans had back then and are having now. And I think what the War Refugee Board staff did mattered, and that we need to remember it to bring greater nuance to our own understanding about America's role in the Holocaust, and to honor their efforts and study them as we continue to confront the same challenges that they did. So does anybody have any questions about any of this?
Were members of the board aware of the efforts by Kastner to rescue ransomed Jews, and did they have any thoughts about what he was doing?
The 1,600 Jews they get out of Bergen-Belsen are Kastner's Jews.
Oh, they are?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yep.
Okay.
The ransom negotiations that Ross McClellan and Sally Meyer are doing, Kastner is with the Nazis on that side. He's not.
So is the board working with Kastner on this, or what's the relationship between the board and Kastner?
The board finds out about Kastner. They find out Kastner gets involved with Kurt Becker. Kurt Becker is in Hungary, is working with Eichmann in Hungary. Kastner gets involved there. Joel Brand had been working with Kastner, ends up in Turkey and brings out the first ransom negotiation. It all gets swirly because there's maybe 4 or 5 ransom negotiations going on at once. But the big one, the one that Sally Meyer and Kurt Becker and Ross McClellan are doing, is specifically with Kastner. And the Jews that get out of Bergen-Belsen are Kastner's, the Kastner-trained Jews.
Did any members of the board, I can't remember, did any members of the board testify or offer support for Kastner in his trial later on?
No. McClelland, I think, writes a letter talking about Kastner, but even he's dubious of Kastner's intentions. Yeah. He just wants to he wants to try to save people. And so nothing is quite clear on either side. The Nazis aren't clear of what the Americans are willing to do. The Americans aren't quite clear what's going on the Nazi side and how long they can string them along. And Kastner's motives are not clear to them either. It gets really tricky at the end. But no, the War Refugee Board, McClelland is the only one who could have done it, and I think he just writes a letter. I don't think he testifies. It's complicated by the fact that McClelland actually joins the State Department after the war. And so when his trial comes up, he is in Greece dealing with a civil war in Greece. And so he does not go to Israel to testify.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
So could you speak to a little bit more about the State Department? Because it seems like a fascinating battle royale between State and Treasury that's kind of intriguing.
It is. It's funny. I speak to State Department and Treasury Department groups, and they all laugh very knowingly when I talk about the State Department and the Treasury Department. That rivalry is still going on in very interesting and weird ways. The the way that I always explain it to people is the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration changes almost everything about Washington, right? It definitely changes the Treasury Department, which is implementing the New Deal, has a Jewish Treasury Secretary, is very involved, gets very liberal. The State Department does not have to change, really, with the New Deal. They are not dealing with any of the same problems, and so it tends to be the same people from before. It's the children and grandchildren of other diplomats become diplomats themselves, the Harvard, Groton, Yale kind of trajectory of Washington. And so the State Department is a place that condoned anti-Semitism and nativism and to some extent racism. It was still a very antiquated institution in the 1930s. It had not modernized. And I think that has a lot to do with how they deal with the Treasury Department. So one of the excuses that they give for delaying humanitarian aid is that the Treasury Department just doesn't quite know what they're doing. That the State Department needs to guide the Treasury Department onto safer ground, even though it's their job to make those decisions. So they do condone anti-Semitism in a different way than the other departments. And particularly in the visa division, there are a number of people who, if you read their diaries, are clearly should not be the ones in charge of refugees if you want a humane refugee policy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Did other allied powers such as the British Empire or the USSR have a similar agency or similar program to rescue Jews in the Europe?
No, the U.S. is the only one. The British are very nervous about seeming to privilege rescue, and the excuse that they normally give is, well, what if we rescue people, where are we going to put them? And since they're in charge of the British mandate in Palestine, they're very nervous that the answer will be Palestine.
Right.
And they do not want any more Jews in Palestine. This is during the White Paper, so Jewish immigration in Palestine has been curtailed since 1939, and the British government's official policy is that they do not want more Jewish immigration to Palestine. And the Soviets are fighting a war to the death. They are not diverting any resources from the military war to do anything to try to rescue people. And in some cases are actually slowing down so that it's easier on them afterwards. Yes?
I know you talked a little bit about this, but can you talk about where most of the people rescued ended up? I know that they didn't come to the United States. Can you talk about where they were situated?
There is a group that comes to the United States. The board does open a refugee camp in upstate New York and brings about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees there in the summer of 1944. It's partly to do with leverage, again, trying to convince neutral nations to allow Jews over their borders. Those nations are then turning around and saying, well, why isn't the United States taking more Jews? And so they opened this thing that was called a token shipment at the time. They opened a refugee camp in upstate New York in Oswego and bring 1,000 Jews and keep them behind barbed wire there until 1946. You can still visit the site where they were, and the fence is still there also. And if you come to the museum in Washington, we actually have a piece of the fence on display. Some end up in Switzerland. Many are simply liberated when the Allied armies come through their areas. So physical escape is limited. So, about 4,000 end up making it to Sweden with Ivar Olsen's boats and guns. About 8,000 get to Palestine with Ira Hirschman, the Bloomingdale's marketing executives, doing a whole host of diplomacy involved in getting the British to allow these groups to get there. Some make it over borders, but the vast majority are simply liberated when the Allied armies come through. The main thing that the board is really doing is keeping them alive inside territory as long as possible. So provide food, support for people who are hiding Jews, false papers, that sort of thing, and then hoping that the armies take care of the rest, which is inevitably what happens. The realistic thing is the military war is what ends the Holocaust. It's the liberation of camps. Yes?
About how many staff members do they have at their peak?
So it's funny because historians who are dismissive of the board's work say that they were understaffed and underfunded. This is actually not true if you go through their papers. The Bureau of the Budget, which is kind of the precursor to what is it, OMB?
Yeah.
OMB, the precursors to OMB, put a cap on 25 members, which historians argue was not nearly enough. And I agree, but there were about 50 more detailed to the board who kept their official jobs in their old departments and were just detailed. So they had a staff of about 75 in Treasury, which in 1944, that's a big group. And bringing Paley, moving him from being in charge of foreign funds control, which is now OFAC or TFI, Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, bringing him as the head of the War Refugee Board is actually a pretty big sign, because he was in charge of about $8 billion worth of sanctioned money in 1944. A very significant job, and so moving him to put him in charge of rescue is a big deal. The board also returns, I have the exact figure, but it's $635,000 to the federal government when it closes up. So they are not underfunded either. They have enough money. $635,939.55 to the federal government when they close. For a history person, it took me a long time to make their financial ledgers make sense, because I'm not a math person. But I do think that checks out. Yeah.
What drew you to this for your dissertation, and what struck you the most as a result of all of the work you've done in this area? And then the last question I'd have for you is, having not read any of your op-eds recently that Wendy referred to, what do you think we all should be paying attention to today?
Okay, I'm going to answer the first two first, and then get my wheels turning on the second and the last one. So I don't have any personal connection to this history. My grandparents were too young to have fought in the war. I'm not Jewish. I came to the museum when I was 12, the Holocaust Museum, when I was 12 with my Girl Scout troop, and thought it was the most interesting place I'd ever been, and this is what I want to research. So when I was coming up with ideas for my dissertation, I actually went to the curator of our main exhibit and to the senior historian and said, look, I'm an American history person, but it's dumb for me to not use the resources of the museum. What should I do? And nobody had done this topic yet. And it is the official US response to the Holocaust. There are lots of books about America and the Holocaust, and it is something that gets thrown around a lot in op-eds and editorials of, well, remember the US failed, they turned back to St. Louis, they didn't bomb Auschwitz. And the idea that nobody had written the actual story of the official US response was something that was very strange to me. I didn't come at it with a lot of preconceived notions, and so I didn't know whether I would like the Treasury Department lawyers. I didn't know whether they were just working a 9 to 5, clocking in and clocking out as a kind of token agency, or whether they were actually dedicated to this job. And I came away, and I think this was what surprised me the most, I came away being such a fan of them. Their decision making holds up when you know what intelligence they have. They are incredibly thoughtful, dedicated civil servants who are trying to save lives and sacrificing a lot to try to do so. And for a historian, that's not necessarily a comfortable place to be in. We're used to really critiquing our subjects and looking at them from all sides. And I looked at them from all sides, and I can't find a lot to fault them with. I tried really hard, and I couldn't. I actually really like them, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from them. So my op-eds are mainly about immigration and in one case the crisis at the border. So the one that Wendy mentioned in May was during the separation of parents from their children at the border. And I talked about Ross McClelland in Les Milles in the summer of 1944. The book actually starts with those deportations, with him in Les Milles. And it starts with a scene of children being sent out of Les Milles by their parents. The deportations are going to begin the next day, and a group of Jewish aid organizations convinced the French authorities to allow the children to be taken to orphanages so that they wouldn't be deported with their parents. And so the end of the second paragraph of the book talks about how Ross Ross's wife is pregnant, she's 3 months pregnant, and they haven't told any of the other aid workers yet. And so he wonders in his notes at the time, what kind of world separates a parent from their child? And the book had just come out when all of this was happening, and my friends kept writing to me and saying, I started your book and I can't read it right now, and I'm very sorry. And so I wrote a history of this organization in the op-ed that was separating parents from their children, and how we look back and remember them as something good, but all of that could have been avoided had the United States had more lenient immigration policies in the 1930s that would have allowed families to come together. The children, some of them were being separated out to be sent to America to be placed with new foster families. It was a huge humanitarian aid effort in 1941 and 1942 that ended up bringing about 320 children out of southern France, Spain, and Portugal, and placing them with foster families. Most of the families in Europe had been on the U.S. waiting lists for immigration, and it was too late. The parents were going to be deported, and so they separate the kids to save their lives. And then an earlier one was about how in calendar year, or in fiscal year 2018 and in 2019 coming up, we will have taken more refugees numerically than we did in 1939. No, I'm sorry, fewer, yes, thank you. Significantly fewer refugees. And in 1939, we had 1/3 the US population that we do now, and 19% unemployment. We are sitting at 4% unemployment, and we are numerically taking fewer people than we did. And so, as a historian, I feel like I need to point those things out, and remind everyone that the reason, not the reason that this is happening, but something that we can do is if that's something that you care about, we can continue to raise our voices. The Jewish congressman that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, who agree in April 1939 not to increase immigration, or propose anything that would open a debate to increase immigration, are responding largely to public sentiment. In 1938, many Americans did not want more immigration. There's a poll after Kristallnacht where Americans are first asked, do you approve or disapprove of Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? And 94% of Americans disapprove of what the Nazis are doing. And then they're immediately asked, should we allow more Jewish exiles to come to the United States to live? And 71% of Americans say no. And so it's the disconnect between American sympathy and American willingness to be part of the solution that I think we need to bridge. And so continuing to speak up, to not get weighed down by the frustration of it, gives congressmen who are interested in raising that debate the ability to do so without fearing that their constituents will rebel. And so it's tricky, but not losing hope is important, and continuing to raise your voice is important. Yes?
When you mentioned the 320 children that did come, were there records of those children that went to foster families and can they be traced?
Some of them, yeah. They were done with the assistance of an organization called the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children. Eleanor Roosevelt was the honorary chairwoman of the organization. And the Quakers helped with that. Marjorie McClellan, Ross's wife, chose some of the children from the internment camps to be able to go. They worked with the Quakers, they worked with Hias to place the children, largely with Jewish families. In the exhibit in Washington, there's an exhibit right now on Americans in the Holocaust, and we show the story of one child, a 7-year-old girl named Ruth Engelhardt, whose father had been killed in a camp, and whose mother is in Gurs, in an internment camp in southern France. And Ruth was there with her mother and then placed in an orphanage, and then chosen out of the orphanage to come to the U.S. She's placed with a foster family in Cleveland. Sometimes they're placed at random, kind of, the train was going east to west, and the kids were let off alphabetically. And so she was in E, so she was in Ohio.
So were some of those interviewed subsequently, those who had survived?
Yep. Yep, there's good records on the ones who have been interested in being available to historians. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. The gentleman that you studied from the Treasury Department would be very satisfied with your rendering of their efforts. Judicious and very thorough, and very dedicated. So thank you so much, and thank you for encouraging us to speak out.